They were willing to die for their country, young, trained, prepared to face the worst possible scenario. And even so, on that day, they were all trapped. The advance had stalled. The enemy fire was too intense. Every attempt to move was met with machine gun bursts that sliced through the air like invisible blades. The ground shook. Visibility was limited by smoke. And in that moment, somewhere in occupied Italy, it felt like the mission would simply end right there. But then, one man decided it wouldn't. A single soldier. No orders, no support, no guarantee of coming back. He stood up when no one else could. He moved forward when everyone was pinned down. And he did something that would completely change the course of that battle. An act so unbelievable that decades later it would still be told as one of the most impressive feats of the Second World War. But here's the detail no one expected. Years after that battle, that same man would be cleaning the floors of a military academy, ignored every day, unnoticed by young men who dreamed of becoming heroes, without realizing they were crossing paths with one of the greatest among them. In real life, the greatest heroes don't always look like heroes. They don't wear medals on their chest all the time. They don't tell their stories. They don't ask for recognition. They simply go on living, like anyone else. And that's exactly how everything began to be discovered. In the busy hallways of a military academy in the United States, where hundreds of young cadets walked every day focused on their own ambitions, there was a figure that no one really paid attention to. An older man, quiet, pushing a cleaning cart through the corridors, sweeping the floor, picking up trash, cleaning bathrooms, and disappearing into the routine as if he were part of the background. To many, that's all he was. A janitor. Someone ordinary. Someone easy to ignore. But what no one there knew was that this man carried a story none of those cadets could even imagine. A story built in the chaos of war, under enemy fire, in one of the most brutal moments of the 20th century. His name was William J. Crawford. But inside that place, he was just Bill. A familiar face, but never truly noticed. He didn't talk much. He didn't draw attention. He didn't try to impress anyone. And maybe that's why so much time passed before anyone asked the most important question of all, who he really was. Because the truth is that while those young men were training to maybe one day become soldiers, that man had already lived through it all. He had already been in the worst place imaginable. He had already faced decisions that no training can prepare you for. And more than that, he had already done something that very few men in history have had the courage to do. But no one knew, not until the day something simple, almost by accident, began to change everything. A book, an ordinary reading, one of those war stories that feel distant, almost unreal. And in the middle of those pages, a name appeared, a name that shouldn't have meant anything, but to someone there, meant everything. Because that name wasn't just in a history book. It was walking through those hallways, every single day, pushing a cleaning cart, as if it were invisible. And in that moment, one of the greatest hidden stories of the Second World War finally began to be revealed. Every single day began exactly the same way. Even before the rush took over the academy, before the formations, the drills, and the firm voices echoing through the halls, he was already there, slowly pushing his cleaning cart, wiping down the still, silent floors, picking up what no one else wanted to see. The soft sound of the broom sliding across the ground was almost imperceptible against the rigid military routine that dominated that place. To the cadets, it was just part of the scenery. something fixed, something that had always been there. And maybe, because of that, it was never truly seen. William J. Crawford, or simply Bill as he was known, had nothing that immediately drew attention. His movements were calm, even a little slow. His gaze was discreet. He didn't try to start conversations, didn't seek closeness, didn't make any effort to be noticed. And in an environment where everyone was focused on performance, hierarchy, and recognition, he simply faded into the background. The young men who crossed his path every day were too busy thinking about the future. They wanted to fly aircraft, command troops, earn respect. They were being shaped into leaders, trained for wars that might not even exist yet. And meanwhile, the man they ignored had already lived through everything they imagined. He had felt the real weight of combat, heard the real sound of gunfire, experienced the kind of fear that no training can simulate, but none of that was visible. There were no medals on his chest, no stories being told, no sign that he carried anything extraordinary. To most of them, he was just the building janitor, someone polite, someone who did his job well, but someone who didn't belong to their world. A few cadets would remember him years later, not for anything grand, but precisely for the opposite, for his simplicity, for the way he moved slowly, as if he carried time differently, for the way he answered with a simple "good morning," without urgency, without intensity, without trying to assert himself. There was something about him, but no one could quite say what it was. It was as if there was a story there, hidden, but without any visible clues. And maybe that was the most remarkable detail of all. Because in a place where stories of war were studied, analyzed, and admired every day, one of the most incredible ones was walking through those very halls, completely ignored. What's most curious is that Bill never actively tried to hide anything. He simply didn't talk. He didn't present himself as someone important. He didn't correct anyone. He never mentioned his past. It was as if that chapter of his life had been closed a long time ago, as if everything had been left behind. For him, it didn't define who he was anymore. He had a job, a routine, a simple life, and that seemed to be enough. But that choice, that way of living, created a silent contrast that no one noticed. Because while the cadets were trying to become heroes, the hero was already there, without needing to prove anything to anyone. And it was exactly that invisibility that made what was about to happen even more powerful. Because when a truth this big stays hidden for so long, when it finally surfaces, it doesn't just surprise, it reshapes everything. All it took was one detail, one coincidence, a moment so ordinary that no one would give it a second thought, an open book, a page turning, and a name that, until that moment, was just another among countless names in the history of war. But for someone there, that name began to sound different, too familiar to ignore. And in that instant, the quiet routine of that silent janitor began, without him even knowing it, to collapse. The moment itself didn't seem extraordinary at first glance. There was no announcement, no initial tension, no sign that something significant was about to unfold. It was just another ordinary day inside the academy. One of those days where everything moves exactly as expected. A cadet sitting quietly, flipping through a military history book, a common habit, part of the training, studying battles, strategies, names already etched into the past. Nothing different from what had been done hundreds of times before. But it was precisely there, in that simple setting, that everything began to shift. The pages turned slowly, accounts of combat, troop movements, strategic decisions, stories that felt distant, almost unreal, as if they belonged to another world. Until one of them stood out. Not because of a famous general, not because of a large-scale operation, but because of a single soldier, a name, a story that didn't blend in with the rest. The description of a man who, in the middle of absolute chaos on a battlefield in Italy, decided to act alone when everything seemed lost. A soldier who moved forward under intense machine gun fire, crawling, closing in on the enemy, carrying nothing but courage and a decision that could not be undone. He didn't wait for orders. He didn't ask for support. He simply went. The text described every movement in detail. The first enemy position destroyed with a grenade thrown at exactly the right moment. The advance of the platoon suddenly unlocked, but he didn't stop there. He kept moving forward. Second position, third position, always under fire, always alone. And then, something even more astonishing. He took control of one of the enemy's weapons and turned their own firepower against them. This wasn't just bravery. This was a level of determination beyond anything training could produce. It was the kind of action that changes the course of an entire battle, the kind of action that turns a man into a legend. The cadet paused, went back a few lines, read it again. There was something there that didn't feel ordinary. It wasn't just the story, it was the name. William J. Crawford. He stared at those words for a few seconds longer than usual. Something about that name didn't fit as just another historical record. It didn't feel distant. It didn't feel unknown. On the contrary, it felt too close, too familiar. And that's when the doubt began to take shape. Because that name, he had heard it before. Not in a classroom, not in a book, but in the hallways, in everyday life, in a completely different context. Not as the name of a war hero, but as the name of someone who was there every single day. Someone who passed by without drawing attention. Someone who pushed a cleaning cart through the corridors of the academy. Bill. At first, his mind tried to reject the idea. It was too absurd to be true. How could a man described like that, someone capable of such extreme actions, be there, cleaning floors, being ignored by everyone? It didn't make sense. But the more he thought about it, the harder it became to ignore. The name, the behavior, the age. Everything started to align in a way that felt unsettling, as if reality was trying to say something, but not revealing it completely yet. Driven by that unease, he decided to do something most wouldn't. Not to keep the doubt, not to ignore the coincidence. He walked up to the man. No announcement, no preparation, just the book in his hands, open to that exact page. His heart beating slightly faster than normal. Not out of fear, but because of that strange feeling of being on the edge of discovering something important. Bill was exactly as always. Silent. Working. The same calm movements. The same posture as every other day. Nothing about him suggested greatness. Nothing about him hinted that the story could be his. And maybe that was precisely what made the moment heavier. Because when the truth is hidden behind something so simple, it becomes even harder to believe. The cadet stepped closer, showed him the book, pointed to the name. No speech, no dramatic buildup, just a direct question. Simple, but loaded with meaning. And for a brief instant, time seemed to slow down. Bill looked at the page, quietly, without urgency, without any immediate reaction, just observing, as if he were looking at something that no longer belonged to his present, as if those words belonged to another life. And then, After a few seconds, he confirmed it. No pride, no explanation, no attempt to impress. He simply said, "Yes," and then added something even more powerful than any war story ever could be. That was just a day in his life, and in that exact moment, everything changed. To truly understand what that man had done, it was necessary to go back in time, long before the silent hallways of the academy, long before the cleaning cart, the quiet mornings, and the invisible routine. It was necessary to return to a place where the constant sound was not footsteps on the floor, but gunfire tearing through the air. Italy, 1943. A setting completely different from anything those cadets had ever known. There was no comfort there, no predictability, only hostile terrain, constant fear, and decisions that had to be made in seconds. The Allied advance through Italian territory was slow, exhausting, and extremely dangerous. Every hill could hide enemy resistance. Every movement could be the last. And it was exactly in that context that William J. Crawford's platoon found itself facing one of the most critical moments of the entire operation. An elevated position, heavily defended by German machine guns, completely blocked their advance. The open terrain made any attempt to approach nearly suicidal. The moment someone moved, enemy fire began. Precise, violent, relentless. The men were pinned down, unable to move forward, unable to retreat safely. The pressure grew with every passing second. The sound of machine guns never stopped. The impact of bullets striking the ground sent dirt, rocks, and fragments flying into the air. It was the kind of situation that freezes even the most trained soldiers. Because in that moment, it wasn't just about strategy, it was about survival. Every second without action increased the danger. Every failed attempt reduced the chances of getting out alive. And it was in that setting, at that exact point, where most men would simply try to stay alive, that something completely outside the norm happened. Without orders, without command, without any guarantee it would work. William Crawford made a decision. He started moving, not running, not recklessly, but with precision, low to the ground, crawling, using every irregularity of the terrain, every small piece of cover, every inch gained was a silent victory against enemy fire. The shots continued, passing close, striking the ground around him. But he didn't stop. He kept advancing. The first machine gun position was ahead. It was the one keeping the platoon trapped. The distance was still deadly, but he got close enough. He prepared the grenade, waited for the exact moment. A single second of hesitation could mean the end. And then he threw it. The explosion broke the rhythm of the battle. For a moment, the machine guns fell silent. The first barrier was gone, but he didn't go back, while others might have retreated after something like that. He kept moving forward. The second position was still active, and now, after the first strike, the risk was even greater. The element of surprise was fading. The enemy was alert. The danger increased with every movement. And still, he continued. Another approach, another moment of absolute precision, another grenade, another impact, another position eliminated. The platoon began to gain ground, but it still wasn't enough. And then, he did something very few would ever do. He kept going. The third machine gun position still threatened everything, and now the level of risk was extreme. The battle was fully engaged. There was no surprise left, only direct confrontation. Even so, he advanced once more. Another attack, another explosion. Another position neutralized, and when everything finally seemed under control, he went even further. He seized one of the enemy weapons, turned their own firepower against them, began firing toward the German forces as they started to pull back. This was no longer just survival. This was complete control of the situation. One man, changing the outcome of an entire battle. The platoon moved forward. The position was taken. The path was opened. But the story wasn't over yet. Because in the middle of all that chaos, just when it seemed everything had gone right, something unexpected happened. And it was there, at that exact moment, that the story took a turn no one could have predicted. The sound of machine guns was finally beginning to fade, the dust still rising from the ground, the smell of gunpowder thick in the air, as the platoon slowly moved forward across terrain that, just minutes before, had seemed impossible to take. But in war, there is no such thing as absolute safety. And it was exactly when the situation appeared to be under control that everything changed in a quiet and brutal way. In the middle of the confusion, the movement, the shifting of positions, William J. Crawford became isolated, separated from the rest of the group, without cover, without immediate support, and without any margin to react the way he had just moments before. And in that instant, the harshest reality of war imposed itself, not as an act of heroism, not as a moment of glory, but as what it truly is, unpredictable and unforgiving. He was captured without spectacle, without warning, simply taken by the enemy in the middle of chaos. And in that moment, everything he had done minutes earlier, all the courage, all the action that had changed the course of the battle, disappeared in the face of a new condition, that of a prisoner. For the men who continued advancing, the story seemed to end right there, because he did not return. He was not seen again. And like so many other stories in war, his name became associated with a final ending. He was considered dead. That news crossed the ocean and reached the United States, arriving at his family, and especially his father, who received not only confirmation of the loss, but something that made it even heavier, the highest recognition. What William Crawford had done on that battlefield could not be ignored. His actions were considered extraordinary, something beyond any expectation of courage, and because of that, the decision was made to award him the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration in the country. But with a detail that carried immense emotional weight, he was not there to receive it. His father accepted the medal in his place, in a ceremony marked by pride and pain at the same time, a symbol of heroism delivered under the certainty that his son would never return. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, reality was completely different from what everyone believed. William Crawford was alive, but not as a hero, not as a recognized soldier, but as a prisoner of war, facing a completely different kind of battle, silent and constant, where the enemy was not only the opposing side, but also the cold, the hunger, the physical exhaustion, and the uncertainty of each passing day. And it was in that context that he endured one of the hardest experiences of his entire life, a long, forced march, hundreds of miles under extreme conditions, without comfort, without proper rest, driven only by the need to keep moving, to survive, to endure, while the world believed he no longer existed. Every step was a struggle against his own body, every day a silent victory, and perhaps this was the most invisible part of his entire story, because there were no witnesses, no recognition, no one to tell what he was going through, just a man who had already faced the worst on the battlefield, and who now carried the weight of continuing to exist in silence, far from memory, far from glory. But the story was still not over. Because even after all of that, even after being declared dead, even after disappearing completely, he would still return. And when that happened, the truth would begin to emerge in a way that no one could have imagined. When the war finally began to come to an end and the prisoners were released, William J. Crawford left behind not only captivity, but also an entire part of his own story. Because when he returned to the United States, he did not come back as someone seeking recognition. He did not return trying to rebuild the image of a hero. He did not demand explanations for having been declared dead. He simply came back to live, as if everything that had happened belonged to a place too distant to be brought into the present. And maybe that is exactly what makes this part of the story so difficult to understand. Because while the world had already turned him into a symbol of courage, while his medal had already been awarded, while his name had already been recorded as a fallen hero, he was there, alive, quietly resuming his life without trying to correct the narrative that had been built around him, without trying to step into the spotlight, as if all of it had been just another closed chapter. And it was along that path that the years passed. Not with major events, not with speeches, not with constant honors, but with a simple routine, almost invisible, that eventually led him to a place no one would ever associate with a man who carried that past. The United States Air Force Academy, a place of discipline, ambition, and preparation for the future. And there, he became something no one could have imagined. A janitor, taking care of hallways, cleaning rooms, maintaining the environment for young cadets who were only beginning to walk a path that he had already lived in its harshest form. And there he remained for years, walking among future officers, listening to conversations about strategy, dreams, and military careers, while carrying within him experiences that none of those young men could even begin to comprehend. And still, he never spoke about it. He never interrupted anyone to tell his story. He never used his medal as a symbol of authority. He simply continued being Bill, the man with the cleaning cart, the familiar face everyone saw, but no one truly knew. And this went on for so long that it became normal, as if that was his true identity, as if the past had been completely absorbed by the present. Until, unexpectedly, that discovery made by a cadet began to change everything. Because the moment the truth surfaced, it did not remain with just one person. It began to spread through the hallways of the academy, passed from one cadet to another, awakening curiosity, disbelief, and, gradually, respect. And what had once been invisible started to take shape before everyone's eyes. Because suddenly, that man was no longer just the janitor. He was someone who had been part of the very history they studied, someone who had lived what they only read in books. And the change did not come with noise. There was no official announcement at first, but something even more powerful happened. The way the cadets looked at him changed. The greetings became different. The interest appeared. Conversations began to emerge. And even with all that new attention, William Crawford did not change who he was. He did not begin to act as someone superior. He did not place himself in a position of importance. He remained the same man, the same Bill who walked through the corridors every day. But something was no longer the same, because now everyone knew. And knowing changes everything. It changes the way you see. It changes the way you respect. It changes the way you understand the value of a person. And it was within this new reality that something even more meaningful began to happen. Because the story that had been interrupted decades earlier, The story of a man who had been declared dead, who had his medal awarded in his absence, who lived years in anonymity, was about to finally be recognized the way it should have been from the very beginning. Not just as a record in a book, not just as a distant memory, but as something real, present, standing right there in front of everyone. And when that recognition finally came, it was not just a correction of history. It was proof that some stories may remain hidden for a time, but they never cease to exist. Time moved forward. The years followed their course, and what had been discovered inside that academy could no longer be ignored, because when a truth of that magnitude comes to light, it does not return to silence. It expands. It settles. And that is exactly what happened with William J. Crawford. The man who for so long had been just a quiet presence in the hallways began, at last, to be recognized in the way his story demanded, not only by the cadets who now saw him differently, but also by the institutions that, decades earlier, had recorded his bravery without him being there to receive what was his. And in that moment, the story that once seemed incomplete began to be corrected. 40 years had passed since the day his father received the Medal of Honor on his behalf, believing his son would never return. 40 years since the world had recorded him as a hero who had died in combat. And even with all that time, even with all that distance between the act and the true recognition, what he had done never lost its value, never faded from the records, never lost the weight it always carried. And that is why, finally, the moment arrived that once seemed impossible. The moment when he would no longer be just a name in a book, but the man himself, present, alive, standing before everyone, receiving what had always been his. In 1984, William J. Crawford officially received the Medal of Honor from the President of the United States. Not as a symbolic gesture, not as a delayed tribute without meaning, but as the definitive confirmation of a story that had been interrupted by circumstances no one could control. And in that instant, the narrative that had been built over decades finally became whole, not through spectacle, not through exaggeration, but through the quiet strength of something that never needed external validation to exist, because he had already been that long before any ceremony. And even then, even after all of it, even after the highest recognition, William Crawford did not change who he was. He did not begin to behave differently. He did not step away from the simplicity that had always defined his life. He remained the same man who walked the hallways, the same Bill who greeted cadets, the same man who carried his story without turning it into something that needed to be displayed. And maybe that is what makes it all even more powerful, because in a world where many seek recognition, where many try to constantly prove their worth, he had already done everything that needed to be done, and he never needed to say it out loud. The cadets who passed through that academy would never forget what they had discovered, because more than an impressive story, they had come face to face with something that cannot be taught in books, something that does not appear in training, something that cannot be simulated. They witnessed what it means to act when no one is watching, what it means to make a decision when there is no guarantee of success, what it means to carry an entire story without letting it define your identity. And that changed the way many of them began to see not only their military careers, but the very meaning of courage. And perhaps that is the strongest part of this entire story. Because William J. Crawford never needed to be seen to be who he was. He never needed immediate recognition to validate what he had done. He never needed to tell his own story for it to have value. He simply lived, did what needed to be done when the moment demanded it, survived what came after, and moved forward in silence, as if everything had been just another chapter in a life that continued. And in the end, when everything was revealed, when everything was recognized, the impact did not come only from what he did, but from how he chose to live afterward. Because while many try to become heroes, few are able to live like one, and even fewer can do it without anyone noticing. And that is exactly why, among so many war stories, his does not end on the battlefield. It continues in the corridors of an academy, in the eyes of those who finally understood who he was, and in the reminder that sometimes the greatest heroes are not where everyone is looking. They are walking beside us, in silence, every single day, without needing to prove anything to anyone.